Welcome to Silly Syntax and Plautus. Now, I have a question for all of you in the audience. What do you call a three-humped camel? Pregnant! Seriously though, what makes this joke funny? The traditional anatomy of a joke involves a setup, like what do you call X, and a payoff, Y, something unexpected, which ties into the incongruity theory of humor, which postulates that humor is created by subversion of expectations. The payoff subverts the setup. But has this always been true? Did ancient sources use features of not just ideas communicated, but the words and sentences used in communicating them to create this humor? When we look at how humor is communicated in Plautus's Menaechmi, I think the answer is yes. My thesis is that Plautus deliberately manipulates Latin syntax to effect humor through surprise and misdirection in his Menaechmi. In order to prove this, I will explain the unique syntactical features of Latin, then show some specific examples of how Plautus uses those features in his comedy, along with corroborating sources to emphasize consistent use of those techniques. So in order to understand how Plautus uses Latin syntax, we first have to understand how Latin functions as a language. Linguistics professors Michael Hahn and Yang Xu explain in their 2022 article that language can be divided into two classes of syntax: subject-verb-object order and subject-object-verb order. In subject-verb-object order, the sentence order goes something like subject-verb-object. Dogs bite people, as in English. Subject-object-verb has examples in languages like Japanese, with inu wa hito o kamimasu, which comes out to dogs, people bite. It's around 40% in this category and 40% in this category. So which of these does Latin belong to? Surprisingly, both. Both combinations of Latin, according to Dr. Leavitt-Dankart, because Latin alternates between the word orders OV and VO. Both orders are available throughout the entire history of the language and are governed by a number of factors, including information structure, weight and/or complexity of the object, and sociolinguistic factors like register and genre. So, Latin is a variable syntax that changes based on the context of the work. Does this extend to jokes? In order to create jokes of misdirection, you need two things: a linguistic method to form those jokes, and a format to make sure those jokes are communicated correctly and work effectively. In Latin, the method by which the normal sentence structures can be subverted is known as hyperbaton. The Oxford Dictionary defines hyperbaton as a figure of speech in which the customary or logical order of words or phrases is inverted, especially for the sake of emphasis. The above definition may be English, but the concept itself originated in Latin literary criticism. The great teacher of rhetoric, Quintilian, speaks of hyperbaton in the first chapter of Book 9 of his Institutio Oratoria. He explains that, quote, in hyperbaton, we have a change in order. It transfers a word or a part of a word from its own place to a new one. We can see from Quintilian's comments here that hyperbaton is a fundamental part of Latin rhetoric, and by extension, comedy. If hyperbaton is the vehicle by which Plautus creates some of his comedy, we still need a method to explain those specific instances. Simply rearranging words willy-nilly is not comedy. That intentionality is found in the concept of garden pathing. In his foundational work, Funny Words and Ploughtime Comedy, Plautus scholar Michael Fontaine gives a definition of garden pathing. Quoting from Fodot in Inouye's 1998 work, Fontaine explains that, quote, a garden path sentence occurs when the parser selects the wrong analysis at a point of ambiguity in an input sentence and discovers later that subsequent words of the input do not fit in the structure it has been building. In simpler terms, a garden path sentence leads you to think that a sentence is going one way, only to upend expectations and cast that sentence in a new light. One example Fontaine gives in the English is the sentence, the horse raced past the barn and fell. You assume that the horse is racing past the barn, only to realize that the horse was being raced past the barn and then fell. The end context of the sentence reimagines what the entire sentence is and casts it in a new light. Hyperbaton can be used simply to make clever puns by rearranging words, but in select instances, Latin users, like Plautus, can structure sentences where the last word completely changes the initial context. This is all well and good, but are there any examples in the Menaechmi text specifically that support the idea that Plautus intentionally used hyperbaton to construct garden path sentences? As a matter of fact, there are. One of the first examples of this comes from the beginning of the work when the mooch introduces himself as Paniculus. The Latin reads, Iuventus nomen fecit paniculo mihi ideo quia mensam quando edo detergeo, which in the English translation from the Low Classical says, the youngsters have given me the name Paniculus, the brush, because when I eat, I wipe the table clean. First-time listeners would hear the word Paniculus and, given the root, expect a phallic joke to come soon after. This expectation continues on until the line reaches a pause right here where the meter breaks. After the striking break in meter, Paniculus explains that he is called Paniculus because he, quote, wipes the tables clean, detergeo mensam. Fontaine quotes Adrian Gratwick, who explains that, quote, the joke is in the defeat of our expectations. Without a pause after quia, this couplet would bear the poem as the most ineptly placed and feeblest witticism in world drama. Instead of going for the played-out vulgar joke, a play on the penne in paniculo, the last thing anyone would expect after hearing Paniculus's name would be the word table. Plautus uses subject-object-verb here, which allows him to place mensam after the break in the meter. This is a great example of how Plautus uses hyperbaton and garden pathing to subvert expectations in his jokes. Another good example comes later in the play, when Menaechmi Sophocles is attempting to discern Erotium's motives. The Latin reads, Iam scibo utrum haec me mage amet an marsupium. And the English translation again from the Loeb reads, I'll find out in a minute whether she loves me or my wallet more. The structure of this sentence is abnormal by Latin conventions. The me, one of the objects of the sentence, comes before the verb amet. Normally, this would fall under subject-object-verb structure, and the sentence would end there. But Plautus has pulled a clever trick. Instead of placing the on marsupium with the rest of the clause, he deliberately placed the punchline, or my wallets, at the end. This greatly increases the comedy and is a clear example of using hyperbaton to break up sentences and changing the meaning via garden pathing. Also, this meaning is completely lost in the English translation, because where it would be placed after the verb, both objects are placed after the verb in the English translation. This is something that can only be affected by Latin's ability to move objects around in different places in the sentence. The final example is perhaps the most overt. It comes from a conversation between Menaechmus, Paniculus, and Erotium, where Erotium is told, Ego istic mihi hodie apparare iusi apud te proilum, which translates in English, again from the Loeb, to, I ordered that a battle should be prepared with you tonight. This sentence doesn't make any sense really in the English. It's a very awkward translation, and that's because this joke is very specifically syntactically related in the Latin. Notice the structure of the sentence. Proilum is at the very end, completely disconnected from its verb apparare, which is in the middle of the sentence. This is wildly abnormal for Latin, and there is no other explanation than Plautus deliberately inverting the word order to place proilum last. Proilium's object is in the front, all the modifying words in the front. Proilium should be in the middle of the sentence, and yet it's at the very end. Why? What is the joke here? For context, the previous sentences have been centered around prandium, the Latin word for lunch. It looks and sounds similar to proilium, so when you replace proilium, battle, with prandium, lunch, in the sentence, the meaning makes more sense. I ordered that lunch should be prepared with you tonight. The key term, proilium, is saved for the end to make the punchline work. They've been talking about prandium for the entire sentence, so when battle is interjected, it's very unexpected. And you expect proilium for the entire length of the sentence, and then battle comes in and completely subverts your expectations. Interestingly, the same sentence is given to different people depending on the translation. The Loeb gives it all to Menaechmus, and Lowell and Quinn's copy only gives proilium to the mooch, and some versions even give it entirely to the mooch. Because the attribution is sketchy, we don't know who is saying it. While the joke is clearer in some versions, it still works because it's entirely syntax-based and has no essential connection to a character. It is arguably the clearest example of syntax-based humor in the work. Given these examples, it is abundantly clear that syntax manipulation was one of Plautus's many tools when making jokes. Just as our modern comedians carefully structured through syntax, Plautus uses Latin's unique ability to change syntax to make jokes that are still laughed at to this day. Thank you so much. You have a great rest of your day.